depots and bases that were hit by whatever happened to hit those locations wasn't exactly catastrophic in a military sense, but what it did force Russia to do, or rather prompt Russia to do, was move more of its assets away from the Kherson front, something that could only help the Ukrainian forces that were about to go in. The Ukrainians would also improve their odds by introducing a lot of the new weapons and systems and capabilities that they were receiving from Western countries into the Kherson theatre. This included things like the new tanks that they were receiving from Poland. We saw a lot of T-72 M1 in the Kherson theatre. A lot of the new NATO standard self-propelled guns, HARM missiles, which are the anti-radiation missiles used by aircraft to counter air defense systems like S-300, all of these were concentrated and seen deployed on the Kherson front. Now, while I am aware that there are publications out there that basically take the claims of the Russian MOD that HARM was useless or was locking onto microwaves in the Donbass, I'd argue that on the evidence available to us, it seems to have actually made a difference. To cite just one piece of evidence, we know that the Ukrainian TB2 drones, the Bayraktars, had ceased to operate in a strike role in most locations after the opening days of the war. Basically, once the Russians got their air defense sorted out, the Bayraktar was just too vulnerable to Russian air defenses to operate in a strike role. It transitioned to more of a standoff reconnaissance role. Then it just so happens that soon after HARM missiles start being used in the Kherson theatre, we start getting video of TB2 strikes in theatre again, which shouldn't be happening considering the density of Russian air defense assets in the area. Again, this isn't proof per se, but the evidence does seem to suggest that there was some degradation in Russian air defenses, because it wasn't just TB2s, it was a massive uptick in reports of Ukrainian airstrikes on positions in the Kherson region, which means Russian air defense radars were either being destroyed, shot off, maybe the operators were drunk, it's hard to prove it, but the correlation here does seem to suggest that the most reasonable explanation is that systems like HARM forced at least some Russian air defense units to shut down, or indeed be destroyed. In any case, HIMARS bombardment, a couple of HARM missiles and TB2 strikes were not going to be enough to displace Russians from their positions around Kherson. And that's pretty much been true at all times throughout history. In the end, no matter what capabilities you have available to you, if you want to take ground, well, you don't own it until the infantry goes in and plants a damn flag. And while fighting had never stopped in Kherson, battles were constant, artillery duels were constant, it was never exactly a pleasant place to be if you were a soldier. By August, the Ukrainians were ready to ramp up significantly. However, first things were going to get a little bit strange. The Ukrainian Ministry of Defense would request a blackout on information coming out of Kherson as we moved into August. At the same time, the Russians continued to build up their defenses on the right bank of the Dnipro. In occupied Kherson, the administration the Russians had put in place sent out a call for all men in the city who didn't want to be evacuated to volunteer for service in the territorial defense units to protect the city. I'll leave it to the audience to imagine how well that one went. But with the Russian forces building up, the Ukrainians largely silent, and this attack just not eventuating, the chatter on the Russian side starts to change to perhaps there's actually an offensive opportunity here. Perhaps the Ukrainian offensive is a mirage, and with the forces we have available to us, there's room for offensive action. Or at least that's what the military bloggers on the pro-Russian side start to say and rumble about in this period. And it's not just talk. Some of the first major attacks in August are actually Russian attacks on the Ukrainians, not vice versa. There's an attack on a place along the Inhulets River where the Ukrainians had a sort of bridgehead on the Russian side, which is reduced but not collapsed at this point. There's a town called Blahodatne that is taken. Again, I can direct you to other videos that talk about the back and forth of this campaign. But the Russians do launch some offensive actions in this period, and it's only on the 29th of August where the Ukrainians announce a full-scale offensive is going in. This time, for real. We've discussed the opening days of the offensive before, so I won't retread the details here, plus it doesn't help the details are still somewhat sketchy. What we do know is that there is a massive uptick in Ukrainian offensive actions at the very end of August through the beginning of September. These are actions on a large scale that involve regular Ukrainian units and TDF units, and also involvement of foreign fighters in a storming role taking certain villages. The Belarusians in particular are called out. Despite the information blackout, we got videos of Ukrainian troops and armoured vehicles trying to fight across the hellish open terrain, and sometimes taking very heavy casualties in the process. There are videos, for example, of Ukrainian units assaulting and getting to a tree line, But because the tree line is the only cover in an open field, the Russian artillery basically having a very good idea of where they should zero in on. Obviously, they would have pre-sighted that cover, given it is the only cover in the area. Casualties followed. And with Ukraine in a state of information blackout, the information space was basically ceded to the Russian government, pro-Russian sources, and random commentators on the internet. So of course, within 48 hours of the Ukrainian offensive beginning in earnest, people were declaring that it had failed. Pro-Russian commentators and propagandists went absolutely wild. They declared that the offensive had run into a brick wall. Local officials were quoted on TASS as saying that 3,000 Ukrainians were dead by the 5th of September. There were statements that the Ukrainians knew the attack was suicide, but NATO forces, because remember, in the Kremlin narrative, Ukraine doesn't possess autonomy. It just responds to instructions that are given to it by Washington, for example. And in that narrative, NATO partners had forced Ukraine to launch this offensive before it was ready. It had fallen flat, the Ukrainian army had been destroyed, its offensive potential was exhausted, Russia had won, guys. And I saw these videos beginning from like the 2nd of September onwards, and by the 5th there was an article on TASS, the official Russian news agency, saying the same thing. Now at the time, you'll remember I said that it was basically impossible to assess whether the campaign had succeeded or failed in the opening days, because there was no suggestion the campaign was intended to collapse the entire Russian front in a matter of days. If that was the intention, then cutting the supply lines over the bridgeheads wouldn't have worked. In order for that shaping campaign to pay off, in order for that strategy to force the Russians to retreat, it wasn't enough to damage the bridges, because some supplies would always get through by pontoon or by barge or by helicopter. Instead, what would have to happen is that the Russian forces would have to be forced to fight continuously, to fire off ammunition, to replace vehicles, to request spare parts, and most importantly, to expend a god-awful amount of artillery ammunition. Now, we cannot know for sure what the Ukrainian High Command intended, but the option that makes the most sense is that this wasn't intended to be a crushing blitzkrieg breakthrough operation, but instead a slow, grinding fight. But of course, that didn't stop the Russians running articles claiming on the 5th of September that the Ukrainian counteroffensive had failed. Of course, that didn't stop the Russians announcing later, on the 18th of September, that the Ukrainian offensive had been broken, which is also something they announced on the 15th of October and the 30th of October. It is kind of fascinating to me how a 2-day offensive managed to last for more than a month, but you know, this is interesting times we live in. What makes this even more amusing from my perspective is that the articles on the 5th, the 15th, and the 30th are all quoting the same guy. This is the deputy head of the Russian-appointed Kherson Military Civilian Administration, so a local Russian official in Kherson who declared that the offensive had ended on the 5th, and then on the 15th had declared that they, quote, failed in their offensive operations in the Kherson region, and then again on the 30th declared that the Ukrainian military mounted an offensive in the Kherson region, but all their attacks were repelled by the Russian army. I guess if nothing else, we should give the guy points for consistency. Although, to be fair, by the middle of October, Stromosov was publicly expressing frustration with some members of the Russian military leadership. He may have indirectly intimated that people thought that Sergei Shoigu should shoot himself, which is a brave stance to take in Russian politics, and he would die in a car crash on the 9th of November. In any case, the failed Ukrainian offensive in Kherson would roll on, although to be clear, it wasn't without casualties. Every Ukrainian I have talked to who fought at Kherson, either early in the war or during this stage, described it as hell. Ukrainian casualty figures are something that are supported by a triangulation of sources, pro-Ukrainian, pro-Russian, and open source individuals looking at visually confirmed losses. The Ukrainians were trying to launch an offensive over open terrain against a dug-in opponent that still had superiority in a number of weapon systems, in particular artillery and arguably also armoured vehicles. They were doing so in some cases against some of the best troops in the Russian army, who the Ukrainians admit fought pretty damn hard. And they were trying to do it without enjoying anything like the 3-to-1 advantage that you would usually like as an attacker against a defender, let alone an attacker under these sort of circumstances. But the attacks continued. They would scout, pick out positions, and then assault identified critical points. There was a heavy application of artillery, air power, and specialised systems on both sides, even the re-emergence, as I've said briefly, of the TB2 on the Ukrainian side, all to move the front line forward, one, occasionally two villages at a time. Now, the details of which village changed hands to which unit in which order That story could occupy, and I expect one day will occupy, multiple documentary series. But in some ways it's also besides the large point, and you know I always try and zoom out a little. The base of the Ukrainian strategy seems to have been to corrode the Russian forces that were defending, to throttle their supply lines, to constantly reduce the throughput of supplies and reinforcements that could reach them, while forcing expenditure rates up as high as possible. This is why the attack on the Crimean Bridge mattered. This is why the HIMARS attacks on the Antonovsky and other crossings mattered, because they throttled Russian supply capabilities. And so, to explain this stage of the fighting to you, I'm not going to tell the tale of a particular town, assault, or military operation. I'm going to tell you the story of the Antonovsky Bridge, because from a logistical perspective, the Antonovsky Bridge was one of the most critical logistic links involved in this stage of the war. It was a major road bridge crossing the Dnieper River very, very close to Kherson itself, which meant that there was no chance of the river that you see on the right-hand side of the map causing supply difficulties. Supplies could be brought almost directly, into the city itself. If the Antonovsky Bridge was left intact, then it would be relatively easy for the Russians to supply forces around Kherson itself. If it could be destroyed or put out of action, well then the Russians would be restricted to Far Eastern diversions, or using things like barges and helicopters and pontoons to move supplies across the river. And none of those are particularly good options if you're trying to move ammunition, armored vehicles and reinforcements by the thousands of tons. And so the Antonovsky Bridge would be one of the highest priority targets for Ukrainian HIMARS strikes. And because it was within visual range of the city of Kherson itself, Ukrainian citizens with their mobile phones were able to film and document every stage of the campaign to come. A back and forth war between Ukrainian missile crews and Russian engineers to put this bridge out of action or restore it respectively. The opening back and forth to put the Antonovsky Bridge out of action would be something of a legend. There'd be a few testing HIMARS strikes, and then the Russians would release a video of gentlemen with clipboards and warning cones on the bridge announcing that it would be back in service relatively quickly, ignoring the fact that by putting out videos showing the damage to the bridge, the Russians were essentially doing bomb damage assessment for the Ukrainians. From there, the social media side of this war made this one of the most watched campaigns against inanimate object, I would argue, in human history. And I don't think that's an exaggeration. I've got examples here from the Antonovsky Bridge thread that was put together by the Twitter account Special Kherson Cat, documenting just a couple of these. So for example, on October the 3rd, there was photographic evidence being posted on the internet that Russian vehicles were now able to cross the bridge again, clearly because they'd repaired enough damage that trucks were able to cross. So of course, on the 5th of October we saw images of the bridge being struck by HIMARS again, and once again being put out of action. The pressure on the bridge was relentless, and every step of the way, either Russian news channels or locals provided bomb damage assessment footage and images that kept everyone on the internet closely informed on the state of the Antonovsky Bridge. The world was essentially getting daily updates on American military surplus being converted into extremely strategically significant architectural remodeling half a world away. By early November, when the Russian retreats began to approach, multiple pontoon and barge bridges had been destroyed. The Antonovsky Bridge itself was unusable, a horrible mess of pockmarks basically having cut it in at least one location. Although ultimately the barge bridge was usable when a number of Russian troops were videoed leaving Kherson on foot over the bridge at the time of the withdrawal. From an open source intelligence gathering perspective, the Antonovsky Bridge campaign also gave us some interesting footage showing Russian short-range air defenses attempting to engage incoming HIMARS rockets, and the GIMLRs still impacting the Antonovsky Bridge regardless. Evidence that we use to calibrate against Russian statements that their SHORAD is entirely effective against HIMARS rockets. In the end, however, despite continuous attacks by the Ukrainians, it would be the Russians that would deal the final blow to the Antonovsky Bridge. After the Russian withdrawal was complete, they blew the bridge, detonating a major segment of it, collapsing it into the water, giving us this image that began to surface on the 11th of November. In the end, based on the evidence available, I'd conclude the Ukrainian offensive using HIMARS and systems of that sort against the Antonovsky and other bridges was mostly successful. they seem to have succeeded in throttling the ability of the Russians to supply their forces in Kherson, forcing them to withdraw. But they were not so thoroughly destroyed or cut as to prevent the Russians using, for example, that barge bridge to get troops and individuals out on foot under the cover of darkness. And now, of course, in its destroyed state, there's little prospect of the Antonovsky being used to support Ukrainian actions on the other side of the Dnipro. Mostly because it turns out that if you're trying to destroy a heavy reinforced concrete structure, it's generally a lot easier to rig it with a shit ton of high explosives and blow it in place than it is to steadily pockmark and erode the structure using long-range guided munitions. In any case, throughout October, the evidence began to mount that the Russian positions in Kherson were corroding. As costly as it was, the Ukrainian strategy was working. As early as September, Russian troops and pro-Russian commentators were claiming that some Russian troops fighting in Kherson were suffering from critical supply difficulties, which was making resistance difficult. It was alleged that more and more Russian artillery was retreated to the left bank of the Dnipro, and that in some areas the Ukrainians even gained artillery superiority. That didn't stop the Russians pushing ahead with their claim in September to formally annex the Kherson Oblast into the Russian Federation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, quote, annexation later on. The political leadership were now declaring that Kherson was forever Russian. There were billboards up in Kherson saying, Russia is here forever. But the military perspective was a little bit different. In early October, the Russians appointed a new commander, Surovikin, and that gave them in some ways a chance for a military perspective for a fresh start. A new commander who wasn't tarred with the failures of the commanders who came before. In October, he would give an interview in which he described the situation in Kherson as difficult. The government installed by the Russians in Kherson was evacuated to the left bank of the Dnipro. The Russians also announced that Putin had approved the evacuation, quote-unquote, of civilians from the city of Kherson itself. At this point, the rumour mill went wild, with the conflict being between those who thought this was a signal that Russia was intending to pull the civilians out of Kherson and convert the city into a new Stalingrad, and those who believed that this was the prelude to a Russian military pullout of what was now a thoroughly untenable, in logistic terms, military position. In the end, of course, it was the latter group that was proven correct. There was no trap, no grand plan, Russian forces just retreated. And here I do feel the need to stop for a moment and bust a few myths or misconceptions that have surfaced over what this withdrawal looked like. Noting, of course, that while I claim to be busting myths here, I'm working with very limited information about a week after this happened, but let's work with the best that we have available to us now. Now, one consistent feature of the information space during this war is that the wildest claims usually don't come from the governments involved themselves. They come from their supporters on the internet. For example, even if you have the commander of Russian forces in Ukraine, Surovikin, going on TV describing the difficulties facing the Russian army, even when you have official propagandists on state TV coming out and saying that there are serious issues in Ukraine, you can guarantee that in the comments section there will be people whose names primarily consist of Russian flag emojis and the letter Z, talking about how everything is going according to plan. How this is all a trap for Ukrainian forces, and any claim to the contrary is just stupid Westoids being stupid Westoids. The same thing happens on the pro-Ukrainian side, and as the announcement of the withdrawal sort of started to filter out, you began to see some pretty stupendous claims circulating on the net. Of course, not to be outdone by random internet commentators, the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation put out a message on Telegram claiming that the evacuation had been completed, and most significantly, that not a single piece of military equipment, not a single weapon, had been left on the right bank of the river, and that all Russian servicemen had crossed successfully. Not most, all. As you can imagine, that statement that they suffered 0 losses and left 0 military equipment behind is complete and utter horseshit. And frankly, I cannot comprehend why that statement would have been made, because it is so manifestly easy to prove false. Evidence of captured equipment by the Ukrainians in Kherson and the surrounding areas is already surfacing in decent amounts. And there are going to be videos, and have already been videos, of Russian soldiers surrendering or captured in civilian clothes or in their uniforms who have been lost or abandoned or whatnot in the Kherson area. It's hard to think that there is a military on the planet that would be able to effect a withdrawal of this sort, a withdrawal of a large force under fire across damaged infrastructure and not lose at least some of its military equipment, and unfortunately leave some of its people behind. Just look at how much equipment the US left behind in Afghanistan. And yet the Russian Ministry of Defense is making the statement that it left absolutely nothing behind. That's the kind of statement that I have to imagine that even the most pro-Russian individuals must look at that statement and go, yeah, that's probably bullshit. So